What would you do if you discovered that a child everyone had labeled unteachable and hopeless was actually a genius trapped behind barriers no one else had bothered to understand? At Manhattan's most prestigious private school, 15-year-old Charlotte Bennett, daughter of billionaire investment banker Richard Bennett, had been written off by every teacher, tutor, and specialist her father's money could buy. She'd been expelled from 3 elite schools, labeled with every behavioral disorder imaginable, and her own father had essentially given up on her future. But Marcus Thompson, a single dad working as the school's night janitor, saw something that all those highly credentialed experts had missed. What he did next didn't just change Charlotte's life. It exposed a truth about how we judge struggling children, especially wealthy ones, and why sometimes the people with the least credentials have the most wisdom. Charlotte Bennett was what administrators at Whitmore Academy called a lost cause. Despite having every advantage money could provide, private tutors, therapists, learning specialists, and educational consultants, she was failing every class, constantly in detention, and had a reputation for being aggressive, disrespectful, and completely unmotivated. Her teachers described her as lazy and entitled, another rich kid who thought the world owed her success without effort. Her father, Richard, had tried everything his wealth could buy: the best therapists in Manhattan, exclusive learning programs in Switzerland, medication cocktails prescribed by top psychiatrists, even threats of military school and cutting off her trust fund. Nothing worked. Charlotte seemed determined to self-destruct, and everyone around her had concluded that some children simply couldn't be helped, no matter how many resources you threw at them. What made Charlotte's situation particularly frustrating to educators was the contrast with her younger brother, who excelled at everything effortlessly. People whispered that Charlotte was jealous, acting out for attention, wasting opportunities that millions of children would dream of having. Her father, exhausted from years of crisis management and disappointed expectations, had essentially emotionally withdrawn, maintaining financial support while giving up on any real relationship with his daughter. At 15, Charlotte had internalized the message that everyone was sending her. She was broken, difficult, a disappointment destined to fail despite every advantage. She'd stopped trying in most classes, spent breaks isolated in corners of the campus, and had developed a reputation that preceded her everywhere she went. Marcus Thompson had been working as Whitmore Academy's evening janitor for 3 years. He was a 38-year-old single father raising his 12-year-old daughter Maya alone after his wife died from cancer. He'd left his job as a high school English teacher in Brooklyn when medical bills overwhelmed him, taking the janitorial position because it paid more and offered evening hours that aligned with Maya's schedule. His coworkers knew him as quiet, hardworking, and the person who always volunteered for the worst shifts so younger colleagues could have time with their families. The students mostly didn't notice him at all. He was part of the invisible infrastructure that kept their privileged world running smoothly without requiring their acknowledgement or gratitude. Marcus first noticed Charlotte on a Thursday evening in October, long after other students had left for their penthouses and townhouses. She was sitting alone in the library, surrounded by textbooks she wasn't reading, crying silently in a way that suggested she'd had a lot of practice hiding her tears. Marcus was emptying trash cans when he saw her frantically scribbling in a notebook, then tearing out the pages and crumpling them in frustration. Something about the scene struck him, not the tears, which he'd seen from plenty of overwhelmed students, but the specific pattern of her frustration. She was writing something, destroying it, trying again, destroying it again, in a cycle that looked less like laziness and more like someone fighting an invisible battle she was losing. Over the following weeks, Marcus paid attention in ways that teachers rushing between classes and administrators managing hundreds of students simply didn't have time for. He noticed that Charlotte arrived early and stayed late, avoiding the chaos of passing periods when hundreds of students crowded the hallways. He saw that she wore noise-canceling headphones whenever possible and flinched at sudden sounds like lockers slamming or bells ringing. He observed that she took detailed notes in classes but never participated in discussions, and that her written assignments were either brilliant or completely incomprehensible with no middle ground. He watched her have a complete meltdown in the cafeteria one day when the lighting was changed and noticed that she'd carefully arranged all her belongings in precise patterns that other students would mock or deliberately disrupt. Marcus had seen these patterns before, not in his teaching career, but in his personal life. His daughter Maya had similar traits: sensory sensitivities, difficulty with transitions, social anxiety masked as aggression, and the ability to hyper-focus on topics she loved while struggling with subjects that didn't engage her specific way of thinking. Maya had been diagnosed with high-functioning autism at age 7, and the diagnosis had been life-changing not because it fixed anything, but because it helped Marcus understand how to support her effectively. Looking at Charlotte, Marcus saw the same undiagnosed neurodivergence that everyone was misinterpreting as behavioral problems, entitlement, or deliberate defiance. According to recent research, autism in girls is dramatically underdiagnosed because it presents differently than in boys. Girls are better at masking their symptoms, developing elaborate coping strategies that hide their struggles until they reach adolescence when the social demands become overwhelming. Studies suggest that for every diagnosed girl, there are several others, particularly in affluent families where resources allow for elaborate compensatory strategies, who struggle undiagnosed for years or decades. Charlotte had likely been compensating and masking her entire childhood until the academic and social demands of high school exceeded her ability to cope, leading everyone to conclude she was simply troubled rather than recognizing she needed different support. Marcus knew he was taking a risk, but he couldn't watch Charlotte suffer without trying to help. One evening when she was again alone in the library, he approached carefully and asked if he could talk to her for a moment. Charlotte looked startled and defensive. Adults usually approached her only to deliver criticism or consequences. But Marcus spoke gently. "I'm not here to lecture you. I've just noticed you seem to be struggling, and I think maybe you're struggling with things that nobody here understands. Would you be willing to tell me what school actually feels like for you? Not the version you tell teachers or counselors. The real version." What poured out over the next hour was a revelation. Charlotte described how the fluorescent lights felt like knives in her eyes, how the constant noise of hundreds of students made it impossible to think, how she could hear every conversation in a crowded room simultaneously and couldn't filter out the irrelevant ones. She explained that written instructions made perfect sense, but verbal instructions disappeared from her mind immediately, and that she could write beautifully about topics she cared about, but couldn't force herself to complete assignments on subjects that didn't engage her, no matter how hard she tried or how much she was punished. She talked about how socializing felt like a complex game everyone else understood instinctively, while she had to consciously calculate every word and facial expression, exhausting herself in the process. And she described the crushing shame of knowing she was smart, but watching everyone conclude she was lazy, defiant, or simply broken. Marcus listened without judgment or interruption, and when Charlotte finished, he said something no teacher or therapist had ever told her. "There's nothing wrong with you. Your brain works differently, and everyone around you has been trying to force you into a mold that was never designed for how you think and process the world. That's not your failure. That's their failure to understand and accommodate you." He told her about Maya, about autism in girls, about how neurodivergent minds aren't defective, but simply different. He explained that all her behavioral problems were actually her nervous system overwhelmed by environments that weren't designed for sensory-sensitive people, and that her laziness was actually selective mutism and executive function challenges common in autistic individuals. Charlotte cried, not the silent, practiced tears Marcus had seen before, but the gasping, relieved sobs of someone who'd been drowning and finally felt someone throw her a lifeline. For the first time in her life, someone had listened to her experience without immediately dismissing it or telling her she needed to try harder, be more grateful, or stop making excuses. Marcus gave her information about autism in girls, recommended books and online communities, and suggested she talk to her father about getting a proper evaluation from specialists who understood female autism presentation. Then he did something more important. He offered to help her develop strategies for navigating school until she could get proper accommodations and support. What happened over the next 6 months was remarkable not because Marcus fixed Charlotte, she didn't need fixing, but because someone finally understood what she actually needed. Marcus helped her create a sensory toolkit: noise-canceling headphones during transitions, sunglasses for fluorescent lighting, fidget tools for managing anxiety. He taught her to advocate for herself, requesting written instructions from teachers and asking for permission to complete assignments in alternative formats that played to her strengths. He connected her with online communities of autistic teenagers who validated her experiences and offered peer support. And most importantly, he helped her understand that her brain wasn't broken. It was simply running different software that required different approaches. Getting her father to understand was harder. Richard Bennett initially dismissed Marcus entirely. A janitor offering unsolicited advice about his daughter's medical and educational needs seemed absurd. But Marcus was persistent, eventually sharing research articles, connecting Richard with parents of autistic girls, and explaining how years of misdiagnosis and inappropriate interventions had damaged Charlotte's mental health while the underlying issues went unaddressed. The turning point came when Richard finally sat down with Charlotte and actually listened, really listened, to her describe what her daily experience felt like. The daughter he'd thought was deliberately throwing away opportunities was actually fighting battles every single day that he'd never imagined. Richard Bennett used his resources differently this time, finding specialists who actually understood autism in adolescent girls. Charlotte was formally diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder with high support needs for sensory processing and executive function. The diagnosis unlocked accommodations at school, extended time on tests, permission to type rather than handwrite assignments, a quiet space for breaks when overwhelmed, and teachers who finally understood that her challenges weren't behavioral choices but neurological differences requiring support rather than punishment. Charlotte's grades improved dramatically not because she suddenly started trying harder, but because barriers that had always blocked her learning were finally removed. But the transformation went deeper than academics. Charlotte stopped believing she was fundamentally broken and started understanding herself as neurodivergent, different, not defective. She found her community among other autistic teenagers, discovering that her intense interests and unique perspectives were valuable rather than weird. She developed self-advocacy skills, learning to articulate her needs without shame. She rekindled her relationship with her father, who learned that love isn't about forcing children into predetermined molds, but about understanding and supporting who they actually are. And she found her passion. Charlotte began volunteering to help other students struggling with undiagnosed learning differences, using her experience to recognize what teachers often missed. Marcus Thompson's intervention with Charlotte sparked changes that rippled far beyond one student. Richard Bennett, humbled by how profoundly he'd misunderstood his own daughter, donated substantial funds to establish a neurodiversity support program at Whitmore Academy and other schools. The program trained teachers to recognize autism and ADHD in students who didn't fit stereotypical presentations, provided sensory-friendly spaces and accommodations, and offered support groups for neurodivergent students who'd spent years feeling isolated and misunderstood. Charlotte became a youth advocate for autism awareness, speaking at schools and conferences about late diagnosis in girls and the damage caused by years of misunderstanding. Marcus returned to teaching, hired by Whitmore Academy as their first neurodiversity specialist at a salary that matched his expertise and impact. He brought his daughter Maya to school events, where she and Charlotte became friends despite their age difference, bonded by shared neurodivergent experiences. The story attracted media attention, highlighting the epidemic of undiagnosed autism in girls and the importance of understanding rather than simply labeling struggling students as behavioral problems. Other families came forward with similar stories of children who'd been misunderstood for years until someone finally recognized what was actually happening. The most powerful impact was on how Whitmore Academy and eventually other schools approached struggling students. Instead of immediately assuming that failure reflected laziness or defiance, educators began asking deeper questions about what barriers might be preventing success. They recognized that children from wealthy families could have learning differences just as easily as anyone else, and that privilege didn't immunize against neurodevelopmental differences. They understood that sometimes the most valuable expertise comes not from credentials, but from lived experience and the willingness to truly listen. This story challenges fundamental assumptions about who has wisdom worth listening to and what struggling children actually need. Marcus Thompson had every reason to ignore Charlotte's suffering. She wasn't his responsibility, he was just a janitor. And wealthy children with every advantage seem like they should be able to figure things out on their own. But Marcus possessed something more valuable than advanced degrees or impressive credentials. He had empathy born from personal experience, The willingness to look beyond surface behaviors to underlying causes, and the courage to act even when doing so crossed social and professional boundaries. A Charlotte's transformation reminds us that children who appear defiant, lazy, or troubled are often children who are suffering in ways adults haven't bothered to understand. Behind every problem child is a real human being fighting battles we can't see, and sometimes what looks like refusal is actually inability caused by barriers we've created through ignorance or inflexibility. The question isn't why struggling children don't try harder. It's why we don't try harder to understand what they actually need instead of forcing them into standardized approaches that work for neurotypical brains but fail neurodivergent ones. Marcus didn't rescue Charlotte. He saw her humanity when everyone else saw a problem to be managed or a lost cause to be written off. He listened when others lectured. He sought to understand when others judged. And by doing so, he gave Charlotte something more valuable than any tutoring or therapy. He gave her the knowledge that she wasn't broken, just different, and that being different was okay. That's the gift we all can offer to struggling people in our lives. Not solutions or fixes, but understanding, acceptance, and support that honors who they actually are rather than who we think they should be. If this story moved you, like and subscribe for more content about unexpected heroes and the power of understanding over judgment. Comment about times when someone saw potential in you that others missed, or when you discovered that someone's struggles had deeper causes than you initially understood. And remember, the next time you encounter someone struggling, especially someone who seems like they should have it together, ask yourself whether you're judging based on surface appearances or truly understanding what barriers they might be facing. Because sometimes the only thing standing between struggle and success is one person willing to truly see and understand.